The Warlock engineer stood motionless, his eyes filled with malevolent amusement at the screams of the dying as they echoed up the dark passage. Chieftain Skrit of Clan Liskit glanced nervously towards the figure standing at his side as the rival clan attacked once more. Skrit found his gaze unconsciously drawn once again to his Clan Skyer ally's left arm. The hand had been roughly severed, replaced with an arcane-looking pronged device. Strange, green-tinged electricity danced over its dark blades, lighting the darkness. From his position atop the rough barricade, the chieftain could see the enemy clan rats swarming up the dark circular tunnel. They moved as an unstoppable wave, overrunning the defenders below through sheer weight of numbers. Skrit looked around hurriedly for an escape route, for the living tide of Skaven would surely smash aside the hastily erected Liskit defences. The arcane scientist twisted a few knobs built into his arm, and a humming sound erupted from the arcane machinery that he wore on his back. Skrit backed away slowly from the Warlock as he felt the air fill with barely contained energy, making his fur stand on end and his whiskers twitch uncomfortably. As the Warlock thrust his arm over the barricade, energy began to course through his form. His body acted as a living conduit for the arcane power that suddenly erupted from the blades embedded in his arm. Green lightning sprang from the tips of the bizarre contraption, arcing down into a sea of brown fur, scampering towards the barricade. The lightning split into a number of contorting arcs of light, passing through Skaven and striking those behind, whilst other tendrils of power earthed harmlessly into the stone floor. Clan rats convulsed in their death throes as energy coursed through their bodies. With a sharp twist of another knob, the energy flowing through the Warlock came abruptly to a halt. His body continued to tremble with the aftermath of the power, and sparks flashed around his eyes. He shook his head, dissipating the last of the energy. Flickering sparks danced over the fetid water pooling on the ground below, before they too died out. Still, the wave of Skaven scampered up the passageway, trampling those killed by the techno-sorcery of Clan Skyer beneath countless clawed feet. A quick glance was exchanged between the Warlock and the chieftain, and they turned as one, leaping from the barricade into the refuse below their position. They scurried across the ground until they reached the massed ranks of the Clan Liskit warriors. Behind the two fleeing Skaven, the barricade was quickly overrun, the raiders clambering over each other, their cruel blades clamped tightly between their teeth. Turning his head, the engineer motioned forwards with one heavily gloved hand. From out of the gloom, a large shape rolled forward, an unearthly green glow pulsing from within. A pair of misshapen Skaven pushed the wheeled contraption forwards, their milky eyes staring blindly forwards. The chieftain watched the ungodly Clan Skyer war machine as it was heaved between ranks of clan rats, the Skaven scrambling over each other to keep away from the glowing contraption. The Warlock's eyes lit up with an insane gleam. The assaulting Skaven swarmed down the passage, packing the circular tunnel with their overwhelming numbers. The engineer turned his mad gaze on Skrit.
"Send in your slaves now! Quick, quick!"
Bobbing his head in response, the chieftain barked his orders at his subordinates, gesturing wildly at the approaching Skaven. With a crack of whips, the slaves were led forward, their emaciated bodies covered in weeping sores and whiplashes. Heavy brass collars bound their scrawny necks, and the clinking of rusting chains echoed through the corridor as they shuffled forwards. The slaves Skaven captured on one of Clan Liskit's many raids were whipped forwards until they stood before the tide of invading clan rats. The enemy smashed into the slaves in a fury, carving through their ranks with ease. Many of the slaves turned to flee, panic washing over them, but they were whipped and struck from those behind who urged them ever onwards. Caught between these two forces, The slaves were being ripped limb from limb and trampled beneath the surging crowd. The warlock engineer nodded to the Skaven standing atop the bizarre Clanskaya contraption. Raising a paw to his arcane goggles, the engineer tapped a button on his temple, and a pair of mirrored lenses flicked down to cover his eyes. Skrit stood, uncomprehending, watching as the lever was clicked forwards on the immense arcane creation. A sudden surge of painful light filled the dark corridor, and Skaven dropped to the ground, clutching at their burning eyes. The warlock smirked behind his protective goggles as a wave of heat washed over him. A huge, twisting bolt of green-tinged light erupted from the barrel of the warp cannon, shooting forwards into the mass of tightly packed Skaven, bouncing around the corridor and enveloping all in its path. The Skaven slaves and enemy Conrats were engulfed as one, the contorting bolt punching, searing holes through all in its path. Smaller green arcs separated from the main beam, leaping around the corridor in a frenzied dance of devastation, lunging from one Ratman to another. The surge of energy struck the barricade, splintering the rotting wood that exploded outwards under the intense force. The bolt continued up the corridor, bouncing along the walls into the distance, and darkness descended once more. The corridor was strewn with twitching furred bodies, Skaven figures lying broken and burst, and the whimpers of the dying cut through the unearthly silence. The foul smell of burnt flesh and fur filled the corridor, as the warlock engineer turned to Chieftain Skrit, who cowered on his knees in the filth, paws clutched tightly over his aching eyes.
Price for aid for almighty Clanskaya, most agreeable. Yes, yes.